can't see you anymore. I can't see any questions. So if you have a burning question, you're welcome to ask it, or just wait until the end of the presentation. All right, so the topic today is AI biases, what they are and how to identify and mitigate them. And by the way, I'm going to address it from several different aspects. And I'm going to also, if you remember correctly, if you remember from last time, sort of use the words AI, phrases AI and machine learning a bit interchangeably, because machine learning is really a foundational technology that kind of empowers and drives all of current AI. Or as the joke goes, if it's written in Python, it's machine learning. If it's written in PowerPoint, it's AI. And for biases, I'm going to also use phrases AI biases, algorithmic biases, and machine biases in a way interchangeably too. Okay. Okay, so before we get into biases, a quick note on AI and machine learning and this technology that's kind of taking over the world. Like with other technologies that we have successfully incorporated, there are multiple choices. You know, we can build our own, we can rent, buy, or do nothing. Okay, although that last option is kind of going away now. And really the question sort of boils down to, do we have the necessary skills to leverage AI and machine learning? And if not, can we grow them over time? And what we see right now happening on the market and across a lot of organizations is that's not very likely, and many of them probably will be working with vendors and partners and sort of buying AI. Some of you may be building them yourself, but some of them will be working with partners, and partly because the market is moving to offering AI and machine learning as a service. We are, by the way, vendor agnostic. The reason I'm using AWS is just because they had everything in one slide, which was very convenient to me. But Microsoft and IBM and others, for example, are having very similar offerings, and for good reasons. AI machine learning models are very expensive to build because you need to have these hard to find data scientists. You also need a lot of compute power, and in many cases, pre-labeled data sets. Which are very expensive and time consuming to produce, because about 70% of machine learning that's currently in use is really supervised learning, which learns from labeled data sets. And meanwhile, a lot of these applications address fairly similar needs. So the market is moving to, again, AI as a service, or Microsoft is talking about democratizing AI and making it as easy to use as Excel or PowerPoint. So when I will be talking about biases, identification, and mitigation, I'm going to be speaking about two different but interrelated aspects. One of them is, how do you work with vendors, and what due diligence you need to be doing, and what kind of questions you need to be asking. But the same questions you should be asking of your own team if you're building these apps yourself, or even creating your creating and training models. So now let's just switch gears and dive into these AI biases. First, let me just get it out of the way, and it's probably the biggest secret in the industry. All AI is biased. All machine learning is biased, and all AI is biased. And I'm going to show you multiple examples and explain why it is happening, including vendor products, okay? And it's actually also going to get worse, because just like with relational databases, AI is getting into every important piece of software, and not just getting, a lot of it is already here. I like this quote from Pedro Domingos, a famous computer scientist. He said it 6 years ago. People worry that computers, aka AI, will get too smart and take over the world, but the real problem is that they are too stupid, not people, computers, and that they have already taken over the world. In fact, a lot of applications and systems we use these days already have AI and machine learning built in, and it's just going to get more and more of that. Now, with biases also, unfortunately, because many of them are unintentional and kind of baked in. We may not be able to see the problem unless it's big. And when it happens, and it will happen, it's not going to be a death by 1,000 cuts. It's going to be probably one big event that can impact your organization, significantly. Think of AI biases like security breaches, right? It's not the question of whether they will happen, it's the question when and how ready are you? And by the way, the image here is from a volcano in Ecuador. I think it's called Tungaruahua. I'm not sure I pronounced it correctly. Okay, and when that event happens, it will can significantly harm your organization. Everything from finances to your ability to deliver services, and then some, and most importantly, also your reputation. Now, this image is obviously from a business, but the same risks apply to government organizations. You could lose. Well, actually, a government probably can't use customers. You can't use residents because they live in the states. They can't just go and buy, services from somebody else. That applies more for business organizations. But what can happen is that you may not be able to identify the residents' needs in the first place, or who of your residents need access to particular services. And that can lead to significant human suffering and harm. It can also undermine the trust they have in the government, right? And for you personally, if you engaged in building these applications and some of them come out biased and you are not aware of that and did not expect it, did not put a mitigation plan in place, it can mean everything from not being able to sleep at night to maybe even being walked out of the door. Let's hope it won't happen. Now, and because many of you, or at least some of you, will be working with vendors and so buying the technology, the risks are even more dire because you may have less control over it. And that's why, by the way, it becomes really important to have an AI procurement in place. And there are multiple tools already out there. One of them is from the World Economic Forum. I think it's called AI procurement in the box for government organizations. That kind of helps to stand up, that functions very quickly, specifically in the context of AI and machine learning. But that may take some time. Until then, you need to have due diligence. You need to conduct due diligence and ask the vendor some questions, because especially if you're working with some smaller ones, they may have agility, they may be very innovative, but they typically have high risk tolerance and perhaps less money, less diversity on the teams, and we'll talk about it in a few minutes. They kind of move fast and break things, but that's not what we want to do when we want to protect people. So that's why we recommend that you get educated and know what kind of questions to ask. And I'm going to be showing these questions in the presentation. All right, so what is algorithmic bias? What are we talking about? Here's the definition from Wikipedia. It's systematic and repeatable errors in the computer system that create unfair outcomes, such as privileging one group of people over others. And the key word is unfair. So unfair treatment of people, some groups of people. And let me give you a few examples of what I mean by unfair. So here's Apple Card that promptly got on the radar of regulators pretty much as soon as it was released. It's over a year ago. What happened is a prominent software developer, the inventor of Ruby on Rails, got 20 times more credit than his wife. And when, by the way, she applied for an increase, she got declined. And some of you are probably thinking, well, that kind of makes sense. Well, it doesn't, because lending institutions are not allowed to use gender as input variables in making decisions. And by the way, this couple also they've been married for a long time. They have the same assets. They share them. They file joint tax returns. And by the way, she also has a higher credit score. So why did she get less credit than the husband? Bear with me. I think I have an answer to you in a few minutes. But I also want to show you a few more examples. This one is a much more serious. This is from healthcare. Um, in the United States, many hospitals use commercial algorithms that guide healthcare decisions. And one such algorithm identify patients who are in need of or could benefit from high-risk care management programs. These programs give patients access to specialized resources like specially trained nurses. And by focusing on sicker patients, they help to prevent significant complications down the road and therefore increasing quality of care and patient satisfaction and quality of life. And obviously for hospitals, they reduce costs. Now, it turns out that this specific algorithm tends to give lower risk scores to Black patients who, as a result, get less access to care or these specific programs, while in many cases they are actually sicker than the white patients who got the same score. Now, why did that happen? Keep it in mind. I'll come back to this example and I'll give you an explanation. Another one, and this is more recent, okay? This is COVID related. Uh, we know that Black Americans, Latinos, Indigenous communities are much more likely to get serious complications from COVID and to die of COVID. But there's now also a growing body of research that shows that these vaccine distribution algorithms encode biases against certain demographic groups, and specifically those containing minorities and people who have low incomes. And this is kind of concerning. Another example from a different area. This is from UK and the recent exam debacle of from the last summer, when about 40% of all high school students got affected when their exam results were downgraded by the algorithm. Um, and as a result, many of them would not be able to get into the colleges and universities of their choices had it not been rolled back. And thank God it was rolled back. My final example is from the government space, and this is from the Netherlands. I think it was also from last year. When the District Court of The Hague put an immediate halt to the government's use of an automated system that was used to detect welfare fraud. It was built by the Dutch Ministry of Social Affairs and Employment, and it was used to predict individuals who may be committing tax fraud or benefits fraud, for example, collecting benefits while working. The system was deployed in 3 cities in the Netherlands. One of them is Rotterdam, which is the second largest city in the country, but it also has the highest poverty rate. And in one of the neighborhoods where the system was deployed, it reported just over 100 violations. But more than 50% of these violations that the system predicted were incorrect. And as a result, you can imagine that those people were incorrectly flagged, and they either did not get access to the benefits they needed, or those benefits were clawed back. So hopefully I've given you now enough examples of where these automated systems are discriminating, okay? And this type of discrimination, as we all well know, is against the law. Right, all these good statutes prohibit discrimination, and some of the new ones as well. And this list obviously is updated because it's a very active area of both research but also action. So when discrimination happens when AI systems, are biased, and when they get deployed, they harm people in multiple different areas in multiple different ways. Everything from restricting their access to, let's say, healthcare, impacting their well-being, uh, to preventing or restricting access to opportunities in life, such as everything from housing, education, employment, financial services. And in some cases, they've led to loss of liberty and even loss of life. And it may be, sound abstract, but really all of us could be on the receiving end of a biased AI system. It could be us, it could be our parents, children, um, friends, siblings, coworkers. That's why I think it's very important to know what these biases are and how they get into these AI and machine learning systems that we have been deploying or are looking to deploy. So,
Natalia, just for a second, Janet put a note in there about seeing her slides. I'm seeing your slides in my big window, but are others not?
If they're not, they should be able to see the slides among the pictures. And if they click on that, it'll toggle back to putting the slides front and center.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that, Natalia. I just want to make sure we address
all good.
that.
All good.
Thanks for the technical assistance, Carolyn. All right, back to you, Natalia.
Okay. Thanks, Pam. All right, so that was actually a natural break too. So how do these AI machine learning systems get biased? Where do these biases come in? Well, I'd like to draw an analogy to cooking. Okay, with cooking, you need at least three things, right? We need ingredients, which in the case of AI and machine learning is data. We need a recipe of converting these ingredients into a dish, which is our machine learning algorithm. And we need a person to do that, our chef, which is a data scientist. The outcome itself, that dish we're cooking, is really that machine learning model that predicts some future outcomes, right? Or it could be that service you're buying. And actually, if you're buying that service, or buying AI as machine learning as a service, you may think of it as a DIY meal kit, like the ones you get from HelloFresh or Chef's Plate or whatever your preferred supply is. They come like as a kit with everything pre-chopped, prepared. All you need to do is just cook it, or maybe even just warm it up. Same thing applies to AI or machine learning as a service. And just like with cooking, the contamination can happen at any step in the process, and it can come from any source. It can come through ingredients, and it can come through the person, through the chef, and it can also happen as a result of the error or typo in the recipe. So we're going to take a look at all these three areas in turn and start with data biases, which are actually the source of, I would say, probably most biases in AI and machine learning systems. The way we harvest our ingredients or data is really critically important. Here I'm showing you an example from the Compass risk assessment tool, or actually the questionnaire, which is used to collect the data for Compass. And Compass, for those of you who don't know, is used to predict the probability of people who've committed a crime, probability to reoffend. And its score that the system produces is typically factored into many sentencing decisions by many courts in the States. And here in Canada, we have a similar system as well. It's just called something different because it's by a different vendor. But anyway, the way a Compass collects data is through this questionnaire, which contains 137 questions. They are available online. I pulled out the ones that caught my attention, because if you glance through them, it becomes very clear and very quickly that it's really more of a racial and poverty profiling that, let's just say, kind of objective and unbiased collection of data. Okay. And also, if you collect data through these biased questions, well, what do you think you get? You get biased data. And more than that, if you use biased data to create a predictive model, and predict who is likely to offend. Well, you're also creating a toxic cycle, a dangerous feedback loop, because you used biased data to create a biased model, and that biased models to kind of generates more biased data, and that goes on and on and on. And with biases, like with garbage, it's garbage in, garbage out, bias in, bias out. Interestingly enough, the way you collect data, even the physical devices you use, can introduce biases in your system. And I've got two examples. I don't think I have the time to go into the left one, which is from the city of Boston, but it's in my blueprint, and I can share it with you if you're interested. The other one is really about cameras, photo cameras. Depending on the technical configuration and the hardware and software they use, they all produce different images, different quality, different technical characteristics, which AI and machine learning models actually are very quickly can pick up, and that can lead to biases in the data as well. And so when we think about data sets, lots of people think that they are, objective and biased. Data is just data. Well, it's actually not. And I like this quote from Kate Crawford, who says that while they may feel abstract, they are really intricately linked to the physical space, physical place, and human culture. And speaking of human culture, the data we use to create AI systems reflects the social and cultural structures and norms of the times. And that also leads to discrimination and injustice. And let me show you some examples. Remember that sexist recruiting tool by Amazon that was very quickly scrapped? Well, why did it happen? Because if you look at their workforce, 60% of the workforce are males, and 3/4 of managers are men as well. They're just who they are, like, who they hire. And if you train your model on that data set, well, perhaps you shouldn't be surprised that then your model will end up preferring men over women. Another example I have, and this is really reflecting back on the concept that data is a social construct. Like I said, data reflects the social and cultural and societal structures and norms of the time. That by itself can also lead to some gaps of representation. And the example I have here is around applications that predict which children are at risk of, let's say, abuse or maltreatment. Think of it, like 50 years ago, we did not collect this data around child abuse or domestic violence because the prevalent attitude back then was that children are property of their parents, and parents can do with them however they wish. Now we understand that things have changed and we collect data, but we still may be under collecting data in other areas because our society and the norms are changing. And also, if you're collecting data across multiple different geographical regions, parts of the world, which is probably less applicable to you, but just in case, well, in some countries, in some culture, it's still okay to use corporeal punishment as a tool to teach kids obedience, discipline, parental authority, and so forth. So if you're collecting data from there and merging it with your data, biases, the data is biased. I like this quote from Kathy O'Neill, who said that if we use the data and models from 1870s, when women did not go to college, if we use the models and data from back then, we would still have only 0.7% of women going to college. It's just because that's what the social society was like back then. Now, Even you have access to data if the data exists. Sometimes you may not be able to get all of the data you need. And the example is again from a family screening tool that predicts which children are at risk of maltreatment or abuse. And this is a tool from Allegheny County, but there are multiple out there. Because it's a county who built the tool, they only have access to public data from the county systems. County agencies, they don't have access to private data, for example, from insurance companies, or when parents pay out of the pocket. So as a result, the system focuses primarily on the poor because it's the poor residents who have access and need access to those services provided by the county. However, no matter how biased the data is, the county thinks that there is some value because it helps them to protect kids. Okay. So another quote for you. No algorithm focused on human behavior is neutral. Anything which is trained on historical human behavior embeds and codifies historical and cultural practices. And not only that, what's worse, it's not just that AI applications and specifically automated decision-making system, it's not just that they replicate biases, societal biases, historical biases as they're reflected in the data. By their scale, they also, unfortunately, in many cases, amplify and systematize those societal biases. Okay, I'm going to jump gears a bit here to give you more example of biases. So we talked about how biases come into the system through the way the data has been collected or what data we have access to. Well, here's another example of data biases. It comes from how the data is labeled. I'm trying to remember if I said already that 70% of machine learning we use is supervised, meaning that machines learn through labels like these ones. And this is an example from computer vision. So somebody actually went in and marked, this is the face of a person, and this is a cat, and this is a dog. Now, interestingly enough, a language is very ambiguous sometimes and permissive, and we people use it kind of a little bit more freely than what we'd like machines to do. For example, this example you see in front of you, would you label this as pictures or paintings? What about these? Are they pictures or paintings? And why does it matter? Well, we humans use these two words interchangeably, and we kind of intuitively understand the difference. Paintings usually painted by hand. Pictures are, many cases refer to photographs. A machine does not know that. All the machine understands, and even then it's not really understand. All it can see, this is a picture, this is a painting. And for a machine, it's two very different things, okay? And therefore that accuracy of labeling is so critical. And the question then becomes, who labeled that data set? Either for you, if you're using your own data, or if you bought a pre-trained model, what data was it trained on, and who labeled it, and where was it labeled? Because there are huge factories in China that do labeling of data, and a lot of it is crowdsourced. Do those people even speak English as a first language? Do they have all the cultural and sort of common sense knowledge that do they share with all the knowledge that we have? Now, the data itself may contain a lot of surprises. If you ask data scientists, they will acknowledge that a lot of sensitive, protected attributes such as race, ethnicity, sex, gender, age, disability, and so on are typically redundantly encoded in the data. And what do I mean by redundantly? That means that they're indirectly present. And you don't need to use gender as a variable. you can actually infer it from other data points. And I think that's what happened in the example with the Apple credit card. So for example, you can infer age from a person's music tastes and gender from shopping patterns. Zip codes can tell you about person's race and income. And you can infer a person's gender from the family status. This is an interesting example because 70% of single-parent households in the States are women. So if you ask that question, what is your family status? You can infer, and you don't ask the question of gender, you can still infer that the gender from that specific question. Where the person went to school, to college, to university can tell you about their race. And, things like height and weight can allow you to deduce their gender. Women are slightly shorter and lighter than men. So because these sensitive or protected attributes are indirectly encoded in the data, again, you may be using them without knowing that through other attributes that are in that data set, and you need to be careful with that. Okay, what else can be hiding in your data? Well, this is an example from social media. On the left, we've got a word cloud that represents the language of women. On the right, it's the language of male. And do you notice any difference? Yeah, I think you do. Men are more likely to use violent and sexual language and strong expression of emotions. Now, why would this be a problem? Well, if you are doing some sort of sentiment analysis, either it's a social media or questionnaires or any other mechanism, the way you connect feedback on, let's say, your services, you would be typically paying more attention to negative comments and negative sentiment because we would want to improve services, right? And as a result, you may be focusing more on men because their language is more negative. So what should you be asking of your vendor from whom you're buying AI, machine learning technologies, or of your team if you're building it yourself? Well, which data sets was the service that machine learning model trained on? And where did the data come from? How it was created? What was the quality assurance process? Who labeled that data? And where? Was that data checked for biases, and which specific biases? Because I'm going to show you more, and well, not more data biases, but I've got more examples in the blueprint. But also, when the data was checked for biases, what detection mechanism were used? How comprehensive were they? And was there any remediation performed, for example, too? Okay, that's, I think, as much as I'm going to tell you about data biases. So we talked about the ingredients in our cooking analogy. Let's now shift gears and talk a little bit about what can go wrong with the recipe itself. And with AI, machine learning, you can think of algorithms really as recipes of how to convert data into predictions. And depending on which recipe you use, just like with eggs, you can end up with very different dishes. And the reason for it is what's known as inductive bias. It's really a set of assumptions about the future. And just to kind of help you understand what inductive biases are, let me give you this example. If you've never seen a swan before and you see a black one, you will automatically assume that all swans are black. That's inductive bias at work. We automatically assume that all swans are of the same color or all objects of the same color. And that's how we learn, by the way, by kind of making predictions about the future. And that's also how machine learning algorithms work. They have these inductive biases that help them to predict the future. I have listed here 3 fairly common algorithms and what kind of biases they would have in the context of this example of a black swan. And I don't want you to know what they are because, the last one, I don't even want to explain what it is. I just want you to notice that there are very different biases there. It's just because all algorithms are created for a specific purpose. For example, Facebook algorithms are created to optimize engagement. And because of that, they all have their very different inductive biases. And so depending on which algorithm you choose, you may end up with different biases in your systems. Not only that, in many cases with machine learning models, we also have to use proxies, just like proxies in voting. And remember this example from healthcare where Black patients got a lower risk score. Why did it happen? Well, because the system, when they try to predict health needs, you can't really kind of do that. All you can do is a few things. You can use just some proxies. And in this case, they chose a proxy of health costs. So they use health costs as an indication of a proxy for health needs. Unfortunately, less money is spent on Black patients who in many cases have the same level of need. And so as a result, the system falsely concluded that Black patients are healthier than in equally sick white patients. And by the way, this is just one example of proxy, but we use proxies a lot because there are many things we would like to predict or model, and we can't even quantify them, right? And you need to use something that you can quantify and something that you can capture in the data. So let me give you a few more examples. How do we decide which teacher is, which teachers are great in schools and colleges, universities? There's so many things we need to consider, but how many can we measure? Not so many. Oh, we can actually look at the standardized tests that the student take and how well they perform on those tests, and maybe use those test results as a proxy for how effective and how good a teacher is, right? Another example is which colleges and universities are better? Well, we can look at their student-teacher ratios, acceptance rates, students' SAT scores, employment rates after graduation, number of alumni donations after the students graduate, and so on and so forth. Those things we can measure. But what about friendships we form, the friends we make when we go to universities and colleges? What about the learning that happens there? What about that confidence that young adults acquire by interacting with their peers? Those things we can't necessarily measure. So what do we do here? We just use those measurable data points and kind of as proxies. Another one is, again, from Compass, which uses the number of prior arrests as a proxy for committing a crime in the future. But the question here for me and for you, are we really cooking the right dish, so to speak? What are we really predicting? If you think really, what are we trying to do here? If we take the number of prior arrests, the only thing you can predict from that data is not whether the person is likely to commit a new crime. It's really the probability of that person being arrested again, which is like a whole different conversation. Okay. So these proxies are really dangerous. The choice of the outcome variable and the proxy is really discretionary. That's what data scientists do, and it's really grounded in experience and analysis. And so you really should be asking your teams and vendor teams. What algorithms did they use and why to create that model and that service you're potentially buying from them? Did they use any proxies? What were those proxies? And how was the performance measured? Did they look at false positive as well as false negatives? And did they look intersectionally, by which I mean, did they look at the, let's say, combination of, let's say, several factors? You can look at results by looking at say, older and new residents, but you can also, or male and female, but you can also look at combinations of those. So let's say, younger men versus older women, or, you can mix in even race or ethnic dimensionality there as well. That's what I mean by intersectionally. And also, when they looked at performance and assessing fairness, or how biased that application, that model is, which definition of fairness did they use? Because there are somewhere between 21 and 70 mathematical definitions out there, and they all differ in the kind of output and sort of what they're trying to measure. Okay. All right, so we talked about data biases. We talked about AI biases, what can go wrong with the recipe, with the algorithm. Let's also take a look at the chef. So the person, the data scientist who actually, or the team who is building our application. Well, it's us humans building these systems, right? And we humans are biased. We all have what's known as human cognitive biases, which are really rules of thumbs. They are sort of formulas, and also an abbreviated way of doing something. Some people call these human cognitive biases, quote unquote, mental errors. And systematic deviations from rational judgment. That's actually a definition on Wikipedia, which I completely disagree with, because these human cognitive biases are really built-in evolutionary mechanisms. They help us to understand the world and make decisions very quickly. For example, if you see this person, you probably can figure out very quickly whether it's a friend or foe, and do we like her, do we trust her? You don't need to think for even a split second. You get this immediate reaction. Well, how about this? If we see something like this, we just run. Okay. And why? It's because when we lived in caves, thousands and thousands of years ago, we didn't have the luxury to stop and think, because if we did that, we would have been dinner. And so we developed these human cognitive biases, again, these mechanisms that help us to, or rules of thumbs that help us to make decisions very quickly. And we carry them, all of them with us still. They're evolutionary mechanisms. They're highly internalized. We use them all the time without thinking. And in fact, if you look up on Wikipedia, there are almost 200 human cognitive biases that have been identified. And they have nothing to do with a person's education or ethnic background. We all are biologically wired to have them. In fact, I encourage you to look at the project Implicit from Harvard that has, I don't remember how many, but several questionnaires which kind of help you to assess yourself for biases. And you may be surprised in terms of what how results will come out. Okay, and if we are all biased, and then if you look at machine learning AI, and if 80% of machine learning is basically feature engineering, which is things I have on the screen in front of you, everything from selecting data, cleansing it, partitioning, all these tasks that data scientists and data engineers do, and a lot of them, well, all of them are done by people who are biased, and they make a lot of choices which are very discretionary, then perhaps we should not be surprised that we end up with systems which are not really anything objective and unbiased. It's really more of opinions that are embedded in mathematics, to use again Cathy O'Neill's quote. And just to give you one example of this, of sort of human cognitive biases at play, here I've got 5 data sets, or these are images from 5 data sets, which I used in computer vision to create machine learning models for recognizing cars. And so there's Pascal cars, Sun cars, these are the names of the systems. Take a quick look and sort of think for yourself, which one of these ribbons do you think is most representative of what a car, quote unquote, is? Okay, I'm hoping you have a preference there. And well, let me tell you this, that the researchers who put together these data sets were aware of biases, and so they made their best efforts to eliminate or create as unbiased data sets as possible. And yet they ended up with biased data sets. Because if you look closely at Pascal cars, they have a bias towards non-canonical views, meaning that the cars are photographed from some angles, diagonally or what have you. Caltech 101 cars has preference for side views. ImageNet is very much into racing cars. And Sun cars, the second from the top and the bottom, the one on the bottom, Label Me cars, are very similar to each other, but Label Me cars contains lots of images which have what's known as occlusions by small objects. Basically, have some sort of a small object next to a car. So again, the researchers tried to do their best, and they yet ended up with biased data sets. And like I said earlier, garbage in, garbage out, bias in, bias out. And that's why it's really important to have as diverse development team as possible. And we are very far from any type of equality, because the majority of people who are building AI and machine learning are white North American young men. You can see for yourself some statistics. This is, I think, from last year or the year before, and it hasn't changed very much. And, the recent recently Google firing Tina Gabbro is not a good example of achieving any type of diversity, especially because she was in charge or one of the leaders, co-leaders of their ethical AI program. So what questions should you be asking of your vendors or your own teams when it comes to human cognitive biases? Well, what is the diversity? Were any domain experts involved? Who and how tested this machine learning product, the service, the model? What metrics they used? Did they analyze it for potential sources of biases? And also, are the outputs explainable? However, even if you're working with a vendor, it's really not the vendor who is responsible for the final product. It's really you. And you should also ask yourself, what is your team composition like? And what is your data? And what is the quality of the data? And how does the data align with the vendor training? Because even if you take a pre-trained model from a vendor, you still need to fine-tune it to your specific data because there may be some differences there. Now, there are tools on the market, increasingly more now, that can help you to identify biases, especially in the data. And I listed a few of them. But really, bias is not a technical issue. And that's what lots of people sort of fail to recognize. It's really more of a business issue. And so in addition to using these tools, I would highly recommend that you ask lots and lots of questions. Sort of have these in-depth conversations with your business partners and or your teams, leave no stone unturned and no assumption unexamined. Ask those questions, get educated about technology and ask the questions. Now, there are some frameworks in terms of which questions to ask. One of them is data sheets for data sets, which is a questionnaire of about 40, 50 questions that will help you to kind of interrogate your data sets and document some assumptions and identify the biases in the data. For algorithms, there's a framework called Model Cards for Model Reporting.
What? All right.
Okay, somebody's talking as well. That does the same for algorithms and just the design of your sort of system and machine learning model. Now, there are other data sets, other frameworks. I like these ones. I worked with them. They kind of resonated with me, but there are other ones as well. So just figure out which ones work for you and use them. If you're working with vendors, with partners, there's another framework called fact sheets, which is modeled on supplier's declaration of conformity that is used in many industries to describe the product's lineage, safety, and performance features. And that framework has been adopted for AI and machine learning. That's another set of questions you can ask a vendor and assess the application from multiple perspectives, from fairness and biases to robustness, security, and so on and so forth. Another great tool to use is something called the registers. And this has been deployed quite successfully by the cities of Amsterdam and Helsinki. It contains information about the AI-driven applications that the cities, the governments are using. And typically it provides details around, what are the applications for? What problem are they trying to solve? But also, how are they or can they impact the citizens, the residents, in their everyday lives? How were they built? What data is being used? What algorithms were being used? What kind of decisions and assumptions made into creating these systems and building and deploying them? Which ethical principles were considered? To mitigate the biases and assumptions and risks. And they also typically include information about, who to contact in case you have any questions or you would like to provide feedback. And I appreciate that it's a bit difficult to see the details, but if you go on their website, you can see them in more detail. What is the benefit for the governments? Well, by disclosing this information, governments can improve transparency and accountability. And it also helps them to increase and improve citizen trust, which is the foundation of any government. I like this quote from, City of Helsinki's chief digital officer, who said, "Without trust, there is really no use for AI." And for citizens, these registers help to increase literacy around AI and machine learning and kind of learn what the city is doing with their money, with their data, with new technologies like AI and machine learning, again, increasing the trust. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here. We are at the top of the hour. If you'd like to learn more, we've got a blueprint on this with more examples. We also offer it as a workshop. You're a member, you have access to it. Just download it and use. I also have a few resources I recommend if you'd like to learn more. I've got a few books. By the way, that's not an exhaustive list. It's just 5. There are many more. There are a few videos. The first one is it's about 4 minutes. 2 guys, Scottish guys, stuck in an elevator, which is voice activated, and see what happens. It's a hilarious one, exemplifying, again, biased, in this case, voice recognition systems. Coded Bias is a documentary about an hour long, which just came out a few months ago, which I highly recommend if you can access it. It sort of, again, brings up lots of examples of biases and unfairness in AI and machine learning systems. The other 2 on the right are a bit more technical, especially the last one. But again, if anybody's inclined to go in there, please go for it. All right. Thank you so much. I think it's probably now a good time for questions.
Yes. Thank you, Natalia, for another excellent presentation. So if you have a question, please go ahead and unmute yourself and go ahead